السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نيابة عن المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني نرحب
Good
بكم.
afternoon. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center and the International Conference on E-Learning for Human Capabilities, allow me to introduce myself, the moderator for this session. I'm Dr. Rami Sakran, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to this session today on learning platforms, where we'll be discussing this matter over 4 days. Please note that simultaneous interpreting will be available if you activate it at the lower portion of the screen. And if you have any questions, whether it was in English or in Arabic, please add them in chat and we will address them towards the end of the session. مرحبا بكم والسلام عليكم. نيابة عن المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني نرحب بكل من
Myself as the moderator for the session. I'm Dr. Rami Sakran, and it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists for the session. With us tonight, our first speaker, Dr. Jeff Parker. Dr. Parker is a professor of engineering at Dartmouth College, where he also serves as the director of the Masters of Engineering Managed Platform program. And in addition, Dr. Parker is a research fellow at MIT's Initiative for Digital Economy, where he leads platform industry research studies and co-chairs the annual MIT Platform Strategy Summit. Our second speaker is Dr. Peter Evans. Dr. Evans is the managing partner at the Platform Strategy Institute. Dr. Evans has more than 20 years of experience leading teams in identifying, assessing, and communicating high-priority marketplace trends and disruptions to shape effective business strategy, innovation, and investment. Last but not least, our third speaker is Dr. Rob Abel. Dr. Abel is the Chief Executive Officer of IMS Global Learning Consortium, a nonprofit collaboration of the world's leading universities, school districts, government organizations, content providers, and technology suppliers cooperating to accelerate learning technology, interoperability, adoption, and impact, and the president of its affiliated Edtech Foundation. Gentlemen, it is my pleasure to have you all together in this session. But before we kick off this discussion, here are a few guidelines for our audience. Interpretation is available in Arabic for the session, and you can activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of the Zoom page. At the end of the session, we will have about 10 minutes for Q&As, and if you have any questions, you may post them in the chat, either in English or in Arabic. Now, we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Jeffrey Parker for his presentation. Dr. Parker, the mic is with you.
Thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And one of the sort of good things that's come out of this COVID disruption is our ability to do events like this, and everybody's very comfortable with it. So I'm going to share a few slides, and then we can have I'll hand it off, of course.
Dr. Parker, I believe we can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Are you hearing
I hear
me
you
now?
fine.
Dr. Al-Sakran, can you hear me now? How about you, Rob?
I hear you fine.
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, shall I proceed? I think so. Okay. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here, and let me take it away. So I want to cover 3 things, and obviously we only have about 20 minutes per speaker, so I'll be brief, but I want to give some platform background to help level set. Then I want to pivot and talk about higher education platforms. And again, just present a little bit of data. And then at the end, I want to close with some of the challenges that organizations have faced with digital transformation. And that comes from World Economic Forum research that I've been part of for the last couple of years. So first, why are we talking about platforms? Well, I think the growth rates have been spectacular over the last 5, 10, 15 years, especially for what we might call the big tech, and think the kind of Google, Apple, Facebook, and then add in Alibaba, Tencent, and the Chinese platforms as well. Really high revenue to employee ratios, and we'll come back to why that is. Favorable economics for the winners. And I think importantly, a structure that's proven to be quite resilient in the face of a recent disruption, COVID, but potentially future disruptions. And so we can come back to that. So here's a slide that Peter put together. Thank you, Peter. And we've been tracking these metrics for quite some time now. And you can see that the top 100 platforms by market cap have simply exploded. And then if you look at the regional distribution, of course, we're familiar with the Silicon Valley and the kind of US, but I think that the Asian rise has been equally spectacular, although we have seen some interesting moves on the regulatory front there. And then Europe has been relatively less active for a variety of reasons. And that has caused a considerable amount of anxiety, if you will, among both business and government leaders. So if we ask ourselves, well, what is a platform? We might start with what it isn't. This is a linear value add chain. So the idea is we know how to make things. We start with raw materials and subassemblies, and then we build up value stage by stage, and then ultimately assemble it into some finished product or service. The systems are designed to optimize flows in this sort of a machine, if you will, return on assets, inventory levels, whatever that might be. And you spend a lot of time doing process analysis. So this would be classic management training. You'd think a lot about financial metrics and ratios and operations management. And you'd also think a lot about push marketing. And so a lot of what we teach, and I was a business school professor for almost 20 years before being pulled into an engineering school, is designed to optimize a system that looks like this. Platforms are pretty different and have a pretty different structure. So they're often simple at first, and in fact, they might look an awful lot like a pipe. And so if you think about the way that a search engine originally went to market, so Google in this case, it crawled the web, did all this work itself, built the PageRank algorithm at the very beginning. Of course, that's all changed a lot. And then aggregated users and provided a value proposition that would bring those users aboard. Did that for years without earning any revenue. And then ultimately, that system was opened up to first advertisers to allow for some direct exchange of value. And because a lot of search is commercial, that advertising isn't necessarily viewed as a negative. So they can get away with putting more ads or even having them sponsored, and people still get the search results that they're looking for. Over time, these systems often become multi-sided. And so rather than a two-sided platform or network, it'll open up to additional sides. So here, for example, not every advertiser has the ability to do sophisticated placement, track across the web, think carefully, or have algorithms that can do persistence modeling and then decide when to stop placing ads in front of you. And so you've all experienced this. You search for something and then you immediately see it everywhere. But over time, the systems give up and conclude that you've either already purchased or taken some action, or you're not going to. And so that's the modeling that would go behind the hood on those. And you'll have large companies that will provide those services. And then over time, these systems can get quite complex. So here we've got the LinkedIn social media, but if you think about any multi-sided platform, over time, you'll see them grow in an almost organic way. Now, you couldn't launch like this because this is very much an artifact of history, and every platform faces its own unique launch circumstance. And so you can't just go and say, do what Google did with Android when they launched, because the whole world is completely different. And so you don't get a rewind, you can only move forward. I think one of the interesting things that you see is this notion that firms operate in both roles. Amazon launched as a pipe. It was basically a better catalog that had a website, and then it worked on logistics. But it also operates as platform, and we're used to that in multiple dimensions. But even in its core kind of retail market business, a lot of the long tail is provided by sellers who can interact directly with buyers for a percentage cut, instead of Amazon taking all of the control and the risk of inventory and obsolescence. So even though from the end buyer's point of view, buyers don't really care about the platform or supply chain structure that's up the chain, and they can get the same products or services, the economics, the incentives, the governance, and the cost structures are all wildly different as you start to move further up the chain in these platform networks. So this is just an article that we wrote about 5 years ago that talks about who the players are. And in a simple system, we think of producers, so creators of content, creators of educational materials, for example, consumers or learners. Then the platforms themselves often split the roles. So those role splits can be along the lines of a direct user-facing provider of platform services. And then further down, but more fundamentally, you've got this whole issue of who controls the intellectual property, who makes the governance decisions around who can participate and who cannot, who sets the interfaces and what the technical roadmap is, and in effect, who runs the little economy. Because in many ways, these platforms have become little microeconomies that can internalize and solve some of the trade-offs that we see that are more difficult for countries or regions to solve on their own. And so if you put these side by side, we'd say, well, platforms effectively invert the firm by shifting the value creation outside the platform. And so, in a traditional firm, we've got this supply chain optimization. In an inverted platform, we've got relatively more value add. We're using data, we're facilitating matching. The whole idea is to increase the velocity of the exchange of value. But I think what's often underappreciated by traditional firms that say, hey, I want to be a platform, is all of the management functionality that goes into effectively running what we'll call this inverted platform firm. Because all of a sudden you've got the kind of product roadmap for the platform itself to engage producers, consumers, all the different parties. You've got the data analytics and the data governance, and that's an increasingly kind of complex space. And then you've got the strategic issues of partnerships, competition. Do I allow my direct competitors to cross-sell on my platform? And then how does that create channel conflict with my existing units? So those are all management challenges that especially incumbent firms end up facing and not always solving. And it certainly causes some friction when they try to adopt some of these strategies. But that being said, and again, so Michael Cusimano and his co-authors actually built on top of some of Peter's work to show that indeed, if you can get a matched sample of platforms relative to an industry control, that is a control sample within like industries, the platforms are doing better on almost any metric that you care to put together. So operating profit, growth, research, sales, growth and general administrative, even just market cap. So there is a reason why they've gotten so much attention. But I do think, dialing back to what I said a moment ago, firms need to be realistic about where they fit kind of in the world and what their capabilities are. So that's my platform background. And so if we pivot a little bit, let's talk about how one of these kind of learning management systems sees the landscape. So full disclosure, I have 2 classes that have launched on Coursera. I have a couple of classes on Emeritus. These are 2 major LMSs. I'm not implying any endorsement of either. It's just that I've worked with them, so I have some idea of how that system behaves. So when we looked to work to build these courses a couple of years ago, Coursera in particular had about 56 million users in 2020. And I just pulled this from their third quarter financials, and they were up to 92. So that's a explosive growth, frankly, by any measure. And as I said earlier, I think the pandemic has certainly had some impact on people's interest, willingness, ability to engage in more distributed learning relative to, the bricks and mortar that certainly my livelihood has depended on for most of my career. Higher education in particular is kind of in the crosshairs. I've been saying this to my colleagues forever. I've been saying, hey, it's not like we get to have this little kind of happy world of no competition and, regionally protected because it's hard to get places. That's not the world we're entering anymore, or going to live in. We're going to live in a world where, yes, you may have your bricks and mortar, but increasingly you're going to find yourself in direct competition with global brands. And those may be other universities, or they may be these companies. And so I think that's certainly something that I spend some of my time trying to get my colleagues to understand and believe. And so here it talks about the trillions of dollars in higher ed. We've certainly already seen retail, entertainment, music, transportation, travel targeted by platforms. I mean, there are now thousands or tens of thousands, and you could catalog sort of the different industries that they've found themselves in. I think, and again, I'm pulling this is based on some Bloomberg data, some Oxford University data as aggregated by this third quarter investor report. But I thought it was interesting to pull and just say, we've heard about this future of jobs issue for a long time. And there have been efforts, some of my colleagues, Dan Rock, Eric Brynjolfsson, have done a lot of work in this space, David Otter, looking at what types of jobs are going to get automated, and then what is relatively less vulnerable, and then how do you kind of cross that chasm. Now, the truth is that the evidence on successfully crossing that chasm has not been super strong, but that doesn't mean that we don't sort of owe all of our citizens, the ability to make some of these transitions and the support. And I think that these online systems have the potential and promise of providing that. And so if you look at what some of this future jobs report out of WEF, they noted that 84% of employers have increased their intent to rapidly digitize work processes. So if you unpack what that means, that actually dovetails pretty nicely with some of the work that we did that showed how firms that had already done end-to-end digitization in their kind of supply chain and operations systems really did much better, particularly in the early days of the pandemic. Lots of emerging job opportunities require digital skills. So, no surprise that data analytics, AI, machine learning, big data, but even to, information security, business development, process automation. These are all increasingly very data intensive jobs. And it turns out that those skills are some of the more easily delivered in an online format because you're often mediating through some sort of software system. And that ends up porting pretty well. And I can speak to that directly. I had about 1 week to prep to go online when the pandemic hit for my data analytics course that I teach. And honestly, it worked incredibly well to do it on this distributed kind of Zoom environment. And we all missed the personal interaction, but I think the learning was pretty effective. So I'm going to take my last 5 minutes and pivot to just talk a little bit about how firms that have been convinced, it's like, okay, you're a senior manager, I've convinced you this stuff is important. The economy has changed. That's where some of the future of work is going. And you need to do these things. Now what? So as I said, we spent a couple of years, and this is in a manufacturing context, but honestly, most of what we've kind of uncovered ports nicely to financial services, materials, software, healthcare. The issues tend to be pretty similar, so don't get too worried about the focus on manufacturing. So we have about 50 members of this Global Future Council on Advanced Manufacturing and Production. kind of split between smaller firms that have what they'll call lighthouse technologies, and then major firms that you've all heard of, Volkswagen, Apple, Foxconn, people like that, Ralph Lauren, BASF, and others. So the data for these two studies has really come from those firms. And so the first one we wrote was on this, how manufacturing firms are essentially driving innovation, particularly, and we launched this in that early kind of COVID. And then the second paper was to take a deeper dive, looking at about 20 or 30 case studies, and trying to categorize, well, where were these firms in their journeys and how did they kind of manage through that process? So if we look at the first paper, often people will talk about business and operating models as though they're the same, and they're really not. I mean, the operating model has a lot to do with the process by which you kind of aggregate, organize, and create value. And then the business model is the economics of how you capture value. They're highly related, but they're not the same, and they need to be aligned. So the business model, that allows for running a marketplace doesn't work all that well for a vertically integrated firm, or even a durable supply chain firm that has kind of long-term relationships. And so that there has to be a thoughtful matchup of business and operating models. And if you want to change business models, then you're probably going to have to change operating models. And that was a lot of what we spent time on. And so early on, what you would discover with technology solutions is that people really want to go after a point solution. It's like, I have a specific problem, there's a vendor who can solve the problem, and they'll offer me a solution, great, and I get some sort of an ROI. It's relatively easy to calculate. But they still want to do these kind of platform business models because they were attracted by the economics that I showed earlier. But they discover quickly that none of their infrastructure or organization is set up to take advantage of that. So then they've got this kind of middle slog, if you will, of building infrastructure out, doing end-to-end digitization, building the integrations with all the different services. Those will be different in a business-to-business context versus business-to-consumer. And then there's often a lot of disillusionment that sets in, because this can be a multi-year process. And if you've been really successful as a manager running a lot of point solutions or a traditional business, you are used to going through a strong finance function. It'll have things like return on investment targets. And then all of a sudden you're building infrastructure that has no obvious return on investment in the near term. And instead you're saying, well, I'm really buying options for resilience, for new revenue streams, for adding in different partners, or for delivering all of these point solutions, at least at scale. So there might be some operating expense win at the end, but it's a tough kind of slog. And I've been through this with several organizations to kind of help them think through what those processes are. And so I'll just close, and this is just a kind of a handful, but of course, there's a lot of work at the kind of alignment of leadership teams, a lot of work on collaborations. Where I find myself spending a lot of time is trying to help organizations with metrics and trying to convince them that the metrics that make them successful in the way business ran in a flow pipeline world and a point solution world are largely going to lead them in wrong directions and create a lot of frustration if they try to do some of these more platform types of business initiatives. So that's my 20 minutes, and I will stop right there.
Dr. Parker, I appreciate it. Truly very insightful information. We've received a couple of questions, but I'll reserve them till the end of the session, where we'll be discussing them all. For now, I'll move ahead and start with Dr. Peter Evans to start his presentation. Dr. Evans, the mic is with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jeff, for that great and comprehensive overview of platforms. So what I'd like to do is pick up where Dr. Parker left off and describe a little bit about what type of people are needed to run platforms, right? Dr. Parker described the context of the business models, but we need professionals to run those business models. And so I'm going to highlight some of the insights we've gained from research in that area. And then I'd like to turn to what's changing in the landscape that can actually potentially shape how we deliver e-learning through platforms. And that has to do with the rise of blockchain technology, what they call Web3, and in particular, the application of NFTs. So I'm going to give an example of how those can be deployed in very interesting ways that could potentially have big implications for how e-learning is delivered. So when you talk about
Dr. Evans,
yes,
please forgive me for interrupting you. Are you presenting something?
I thought so.
It's not pulled up yet.
Okay, sorry. Aha, there. How's that look?
Yes, sir. It's working now.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay. So that's my overview I just went through. So when you read about and get engaged in this platform economy, we often focus and hear a lot about the freelancers, the gig workers, the people that are delivering value through these, what Dr. Parker referred to as inverted firms, i.e. these are these third-party participants that the platform helps match to users and they deliver the value. But there's also the management structure, right? Platforms don't run by themselves. They need a group of professionals, and this draws upon Mintzberger's very famous operating model for how companies are structured, right? You've got your operation core, you've got your technical middle line managers and your operations folks, and then you have your senior executive team. So the question is how does and in what way do platform business models need different professionals to run them? And so there's this question of is a platform professional is a person who has achieved a specialized education, training, or on-the-job experience that serve a variety of roles required to develop and successfully run an important component or the entire platform business. So let's dig into some of those roles. And what's interesting is that if you look at job postings around the world, there are literally thousands of jobs being posted every month for platform roles. And they range not just in North America and Europe, but all over the world now, because platform business models have become an integrated part of delivering value in economies. So we see jobs in Latin America and Africa, the Middle East, South Asia and Asia, all over. It's actually quite fascinating when you really dig into it. So what are the roles that are sought after? One is for platform strategy. As companies recognize their need for growth and innovation and change, they need experts that can help them decide what is the structure of those platforms. We also have a lot of jobs out there for platform product managers. These are the folks that have to manage the design of what that platform offering will look like, the engineering that goes into it, the marketing that goes into all the roles that a product manager serves, you find with a platform. But of course, platforms are different business models. And so you need people who are astute in understanding the underlying economics of platforms to be able to execute in that kind of role. You also have these third parties, right, that are not inside the firm, but they're creating value outside the firm, but you need people in the organization that help facilitate that. So there's a huge number of roles now for what they call community managers and things of that nature that help facilitate those external ecosystems and make sure that they're governed well, that the firm is attracting people to contribute. And that may be things or skills like software engineer. It could be, for personal transportation. It could be drivers, for creative roles. It could be designers. There's a whole variety of ecosystems out there. And so you need people that manage that. You also have the engineers that build the platforms. And so lots of interesting roles for platform engineering. And then of course, we talk a lot about data. So there's platform data management. And it's not just the people who have skills in data analytics. This is data architecting that goes to both how data is managed internal to the firm, what its external policies are with respect to capturing data from users. There's a whole variety of things that now go into data architecture that have particular characteristics when you think about it from a platform perspective, and that drives tremendous value. So those are very highly technical roles, but also extremely valuable roles for organizations. And then finally, we have growing regulatory issues with respect to platforms. And so you see roles now being posted quite frequently around what they call platform privacy, compliance. Platforms have become quite valuable. Some of the largest platforms have hundreds of millions of users. And so ensuring that that platform is sound, secure, both from a security perspective against attacks, but also complies with an increasingly complex regulatory landscape has become quite critical to platform success. So these are key roles that now have appeared because of the growth and significance of platforms around the world. So let's turn to e-learning in particular. And as Dr. Parker mentioned, we're seeing platforms move into education and a whole array of things, from very quick, low-cost courses all the way up the stack to beginning to nibble at kind of traditional education as well. And so that landscape it has big implications about how people learn professionally, and then also how organizations decide to deliver learning to their employees. But there's another phenomenon that's taking place that's quite interesting. We're shifting right from what they call Web 1, which is this information economy. And you can think of platforms like Yahoo and Netscape. These are ways to read what was happening on the internet, to this a platform economy, which was more of this interactive engagement. And we saw this phenomenal growth of these large platforms like Facebook and Google and Amazon. But we're now at the cusp of a new change, which some refer to as the token economy, as blockchain technologies become more prevalent and new business models are now enabled. And so one of the interesting questions is how do these new phenomena actually change platform structures and incentives and governance? And does it do so in a way that causes us to rethink fundamental theory that's been developed around platforms, and what are applications that are possible that weren't possible in kind of this Web 2 world? And so I'm going to kind of present an idea of how this may be applied in the e-learning space. And it has to do with the application of blockchain technology. And I'd just like to lay out a couple of features of blockchain very simply. One is the fact that you can have what they call fungible tokens like Bitcoin, which are interchangeable, right? They have the same value. But you also have the rise of what they call non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, which are unique. They show provenance, i.e. who has ownership over those, and also can institute scarcity with respect to digital goods, which has had a lot of interesting characteristics because of the fact that digital goods are so easy to copy. Non-fungible tokens suddenly have made it possible to contain some of those issues with easy copying, and have really taken off. So we've seen an incredible growth of applications of these non-fungible tokens in the last 2 years. Another feature that's interesting with respect to NFTs is they can be static, i.e. immutable, and they don't change. But people are now beginning to experiment with what they call dynamic NFTs, which can actually change as a result of external factors. And so we have two kinds of NFTs that have different attributes and therefore different implications when you deploy them. This is just a list that I'm building. This is from a database that I'm building of NFT platforms. These are platforms that have been launched in the last 2 to 3 years, most of them last year, to deploy in a whole bunch of different areas, largely in sports, music, and entertainment are the first wave, but we're beginning to see new applications arise. And there are now billions of dollars being invested in these platforms, and large brands now are beginning to wake up to the opportunities. So it's a very interesting, it's early, but an extremely interesting and exciting space to explore. And it has lots of applications. Just one of them are the application of NFTs in what they call digital identity. Because we spend more and more time online in the digital environment, and we're opening up opportunities to create these metaverse environments, which are these 2D, 3D environments in which you can actually enter and walk around. People have suddenly become very interested in what is your identity in those spaces. And so there are companies that are deploying NFTs to create wearables so that you can create your own avatar. And there's a lot of interest in this space, and celebrities have gotten involved in making available, and also brands where you could sell items to people who want to buy them to show off, their unique identity. So that's one application that's pretty interesting. This is a company called Genies, which is an NFT platform that is now developing in this space, and they have a big relationship with Warner Music. And so they've got access to big celebrities. And so a lot of people are anticipating this is really going to take off. So that's one application. Another is in the learning space. And you've probably seen many of these. This is your typical certificate that you get when you graduate from a course, right? And in fact, this particular certificate is somebody I know from my former employer at KPMG. And so I saw this, so she posted it up online on LinkedIn, which is 2 weeks ago. And there are millions of these posted every year, because millions of people take these courses, right? Now, what happens when you deploy NFTs? Well, suddenly you can change the way certificates are both issued and how dynamic they are. So in the future, I think we're going to see more and more of the application of NFTs to these certificates. And it allows us to deploy lots of interesting features. So when you receive that certificate, that, especially if you deploy it not as a static NFT, but as a dynamic NFT, that NFT can actually change depending on how engaged that participant is in continuing the learning that they started through this course, right? And you're able to track that over time as a cohort. And so let's propose somebody who takes a course and over the course of 6 months really doesn't really keep up. They don't read articles, they don't publish anything, they don't really engage with the learning that they achieved. And so in that instance, the NFT can actually change and degrade, which would be very interesting, right? And so you can have a dynamic NFT that would record on the blockchain somebody's continuing commitment to learning what they initially learned. And so this is an instance of how do you create incentives for people to sustain it? And so with these kind of dynamic NFTs, I think you can create incentives for folks to continue to invest in their learning and make a pretty interesting inroads into sustaining those learning relationships, and also capture the data as to the amount of effort people are putting in post receipt of the certificate. Not only that, those NFTs can be integrated into the growing use of what they call digital wallets. You may be familiar that companies like Apple and others are now offering wallets, and they're very geared towards kind of credit cards and getting access to crypto and stuff like that. But a lot of brands now are beginning to recognize the value of creating apps that sit in people's wallets so they can keep track of their loyalty points, for example, for travel or purchases at retail stores. But I think in the future, we're going to see these wallets expand to also be able to record and capture and maintain somebody's learning history, right? And these dynamic NFTs can then record whether or not somebody's maintaining their engagement with their courses that they've been taking, right? And so you could see apps being developed like My Learning NFT, which will be dynamic, they'll be personalized and become integrated into people's digital wallets. And so I think this is a really interesting way in which the application of these kind of Web3 capabilities can be then integrated into a platform structure that could then be used across many, many different e-learning platforms in a very dynamic way that both benefits the organizations that are offering those courses as well as the participants that want to demonstrate that they are engaged and they're continuing to work, and they just need that nudge, right? We all need that little extra kick to keep us continuing on our investments. And so when you think about kind of where these kind of learning NFTs could be easily deployed, probably not in these really short programs, and probably to a lesser degree, the more formal degree programs. But there's a huge sweet spot between courses and certificates. And this is a huge space. You know, the Coursera data that Dr. Parker just presented shows that this is a massive, you know, we're talking hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in economic value that could be potentially deployed. And these dynamic NFTs could be a very interesting and innovative way of sustaining that learning. So just to conclude, I think I would agree with Dr. Parker that platforms become a powerful force in the global economy, and it's driving a new class of professionals, right, to run these platforms, and that requires new educational capabilities and skills. So that's a really interesting space. And then finally, these NFTs will change the e-learning landscape and offer ways to introduce dynamic certificates rather than these old static certificates. So that's what I had to present today, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Evans. We have a couple of questions, but as I mentioned earlier, we'll keep them towards the end. Honestly, I was very struck by the NFTs, especially for the certification. And let me find the right word for it. It's very cool, honestly.
Very cool.
Very cool. Let me move ahead and go with Dr. Rob Abel. Dr. Rob Abel, we're ready to hear you out. And if you have any presentation, please pull it up. Dr. Abel?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Al-Sakran. I am going to share my screen here. So, it says the other participant needs to stop sharing. There you go. Yeah, if you could stop sharing, Peter, that would be.
Yeah, hold on.
Awesome.
How do I see what's happened. It's been blocked a little bit. Share, stop share. Okay.
There you go. Thank you.
Sure thing.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if I can get the right one up here. Okay, so hopefully now you should be seeing my screen.
Yep, we can see it.
This whole conversation is very cool, I'll say. My thanks to NELC for inviting me, and in particular also the organization I lead, the IMS Global Learning Consortium, to join this e-learning for human capability development conference. I just wanted to note that in addition to my talk here, our chief architect, Dr. Colin Smythe, is giving a workshop on the Learning Tools Interoperability Standard, which is otherwise known as LTI, from IMS in another session. I am very, very honored to be talking about this particular topic, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to come in third after my esteemed colleagues here, Peter and Jeffrey, because I learned so much already from what they had to say. What I'll be doing here is trying to provide what I think is a complementary discussion on platform ecosystems. I'm bringing in the term ecosystems here. And you'll also note that when I use the term platform, it will be less as a business model or business strategy and more as an industry strategy. But I'll just make that distinguishment up front. And what I'm presenting here is specifically based on what we've learned. I've been the CEO of IMS for a little over 16 years now. And we interact with over 700 educational and technology member organizations literally every day. And we are clearly the leading nonprofit-based member consortium supporting open standards in EdTech. So you can see my contact information here if you need to contact me directly. My agenda, of course, is very brief, pretty high level. My goal is to talk about achieving what I'll just call a beneficial EdTech ecosystem, an ecosystem that provides maximum benefits to all the stakeholders, but especially the learners. You know, how do we define such a thing? What are the goals of it? How do we ensure it meets the needs of stakeholders? Now, as the previous presenters have definitely gotten us very excited about the possibility of education capabilities, and we're all excited because education is one of the largest industries in the world. It's roughly 5% of GDP on average, according to OECD. That part is not new. The new part is what's shown here, is that the investment in education technology, particularly from venture capitalists, has been rising dramatically. Now, this level that you're seeing here is still less than half of what's invested, say, for instance, in health tech. But as you can see, the growth is very impressive. And that growth in itself provides a huge catalyst to the ecosystem, which we'll start talking about. You know, so if there's a lot of investment, what happens? Well, it leads to a lot of products, right? And this is just one chart from EduVentures from 2017, just focused on the US, just focused on higher ed. I'm sure you've probably seen others like it. The point is not for you to be able to read the logos of all these products, so please don't try to do that, but just to note how many there are. So now, while all these products are designed, I'm sure, to help users, the complexity of the potential interaction amongst the products increases by the square of the number of products. And the more diverse the ecosystem is in terms of support for varying models of educational delivery and diversity of educational needs, the long tail sort of phenomenon, if you want to call it that, well, this just adds even more complexity. Now, so the EdTech ecosystem, I'll just state, without any further proof, is a rather messy system. I'm in it every day, and I can definitely vouch for that. But like all systems, it's trying to organize itself to survive and prosper. For many years now here in IMS, we've been referencing back to, I apologize, a very old paper, 1993 paper by James Moore that introduced the term business ecosystem, which relates back to platform. It describes the structure and behavior of a network of organizations sharing a technological platform. We believe the EdTech, we talk about a lot, that the EdTech ecosystem is in fact a business ecosystem, but it has some fairly unique characteristics. To fully understand the ecosystem, we need to understand who the participants and the stakeholders are. As you can see, the EdTech ecosystem is not, at least currently, supplier-centric. There are no dominant suppliers, for instance, as in the case of many other industries. And Coursera, of course, has been very successful. So has 2U, the company that recently bought edX and so forth. But they are not dominant. They are not considered dominant suppliers in the education industry. They're very important suppliers. They're growing and they could grow much larger. But currently we have relatively little direct-to-consumer power exhibited between the suppliers and the buyers in education. And that has a lot of ramifications on the ability to kind of run unopposed. You know, The power is intermediated by institutions, governments, regional diversity of needs. Even individual faculty can be a competitive factor. Yes, they can join in and be part of Coursera, but yes, also they could compete with Coursera on another platform, just as an example. And we've seen that with the emergence of some of the OER. So how does this ecosystem get shaped, and how can the stakeholders work together to shape it towards where they want to go? I love working with organizations like NELP because through organizations such as theirs, we see there are many opportunities to improve education. Experiences in all regions around the world tell us that we need improvement everywhere in the world in these various parameters here. We need education to improve in so many ways. We need it to be more affordable. We need it to be higher quality. We need it to be more engaging, more flexible, more personalized. We need outcomes that, such as whether they're NFTs or what have you. We need the outcomes to be a better match to the lifelong needs of each individual, opening up greater opportunities. And note that these require improvements in the educational ecosystem itself, not just the technology of education or the EdTech products. And also note this balance between cost and innovation, and cost and quality, very important in terms of the education sector. So the analyst firm FutureSource created this great graphic a few years ago, which asks important questions about how will the ecosystem shake out? And from where I sit, I see another side to this question, which is how do the stakeholders work together to shape the ecosystem? And there are many great questions on this chart whose answers could help make the ecosystem less complex and therefore more successful for all. How do the products interoperate? What data is important? What are the nodal platforms? Who controls the data? All of these questions are being answered, which kind of relating back to what Jeff was talking about. Maybe we're still in that stage 2 slog, I think, but we're probably getting ready to move on to that stage 3, which is very exciting. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about what we do in IMS, just so you understand where I'm coming from and kind of what we're seeing. And you know, I've had the privilege to lead this organization for 16 years. We believe we're facilitating progress among ecosystem stakeholders to shape answers to the sort of questions that were on the previous page. Collectively, we produced open technical standards that we believe are defining the rules of the ecosystem as it evolves. Some of those standards are shown here. And you know, some of our standards, the names of them are actually known much better than the name of the organization, IMS Global Learning Consortium. And even if you don't know these standards, if you're, for instance, in a US university, you are using these standards whether you know it or not, because they are literally in every university and every learning management system and so forth that's out there. Now, I'm not going to go through them. You can check them out on your own, but the names are pretty descriptive in terms of what they do in the different areas. I think we'll probably get into some of that in the Q&A. So note that this is not a particular software platform, as obviously the standards can be adopted by any software platform. But what this is a powerful shared investment in an overall business platform ecosystem, right? That enables product platforms and diverse other products to be successful. And we've actually seen many, many examples of that occurring over the last 10 years, for example. In particular, in IMS, we're focused on areas that do have to do with teaching and learning. We're trying to enable future educational models. That's extremely important. We're not looking backwards at where education has been. We're looking forwards at where we think education needs to be. So these are the 5 areas that we're focusing on now: curriculum innovation, learning platforms and tools, integrated assessment, learning data and analytics, and digital credentials and pathways. Interestingly, our membership is split 50-50 between end user stakeholder organizations, meaning higher education institutions and K-12 school districts and government agencies, and suppliers. Okay, so it's a very, very interesting dynamic. But what that allows us to do is also work together to prove out these standards in practice, to make them work in practice at large scale. And as a result, the standards have had a very profound impact on in terms of shaping product categories. I think most people that use the learning management system today would say there are certain aspects, if not the majority of aspects of the learning management system, ideas that came directly out of the work of IMS, which started in the mid 1990s, before the advent of the LMS today. So our members are organizations. They lead this work. Our job is to facilitate it. And by leading it, they're helping drive an ecosystem direction. The growth has been pretty impressive. We've added last year, we added, during the pandemic, we added 114 new members without having any face-to-face meetings. And normally we might have 10 face-to-face meetings in a year around the world. The membership is currently over 700. It's, believe it or not, the membership number is substantially larger than the World Wide Web Consortium, believe it or not, which is the world's sort of best known nonprofit member-based standards consortium. And if you look on our website, you'd see who the members are. It's pretty much a who's who of the EdTech world. Now, the 700 members equate to almost 7,000 individuals who essentially are collaborating every day to make this ecosystem move. And they represent their organizations. Now, the thing that's amazing to me, and what we shot for when I first came in IMS, is much more, it is kind of a platform strategy. I think it definitely is. We're basically trying to get a high return on investment by a large number of organizations investing in the same thing, right? Something they all can use. And what has happened now is that the investment in the IMS work is orders of magnitude greater than what any single supplier can afford to invest. And so it really has become smarter for suppliers to adopt the IMS standards. And typically the earlier they adopt them in their life cycle, the better they are, because they get even more return on investment rather than recreating their own. So a very important part of what we do many things with the members. We hold over 500 work group meetings a year. It's almost phenomenal, the scale of it. But we also provide a key essential element of support that helps organizations really of any size successfully adopt open standards, which to me is kind of the acid test of the quality of an open standard. Has it lowered the barriers to entry? Has it lowers the barriers to innovation? Does it allow even smaller innovative organizations to build, successful businesses? So what we do is we provide support to help those organizations implement the open standards. We also provide verification through certification. And this is a screenshot of our product directory, which is available on the public on the website or directly at imscert.org. And there are over 7,000 IMS certified products. And we stand behind those certifications, meaning that if there is a problem in the marketplace in terms of interoperability, we will, amongst those certified products, we will actually jump in. And now we're even doing more testing. We're doing testing actually on site in school districts and in universities to make sure that fielded systems are implementing interoperability successfully. So my apologies for covering all that very quickly. And I probably, for some of you, I didn't answer many in-depth questions you probably have about all that, because there is a lot more to it. But I'd like to summarize with a few thoughts. First, I really believe, and I'd like to leave you with the fact that there is just a great opportunity to collaborate and to shape the EdTech ecosystem among the diverse stakeholders, so both within regions and worldwide. And for application of technology to education in a sort of a sector that's sort of been sometimes criticized for not adopting technology maybe fast enough or to enough benefit, I believe that collaboration among education providers and technology providers is really essential to inventing new paths to the future for all learners. Second, when considering how we create platform opportunities, I think it's important to question, the important question is, how do we invest together to maximize the return on investment. Because one of the questions in every supplier's mind, right? If you're in Google and you're talking about education, and I've been at, for instance, Oracle and been in groups where you're talking about education, the big question is it worth investing in education? And the answer always comes back no, because there isn't a big enough return on investment in terms of the technology and so forth. And maybe that's because we were stuck in phase 2. But whatever the point is, collaboration that lifts up all actually creates pathways, I think, that we're seeing that didn't exist before, including for Coursera and edX, who use our standards at some level. And I know it helps them, for instance, integrate their products into universities. And third, I'll just say that I think our experiences in IMS so far are very positive. We always like to say we've come a long way, but we have a long way to go. And I totally agree with the previous presenters that we need to move to that new kind of stage 3 where everyone's seeing those type of opportunities that Jeff talked about, and we're trying to help make that happen with what we're doing. So thank you again for tuning in, and I look forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Abel, thank you so much. We're very lucky to have you all together, and I hope this is not the last chance we have to invest in those opportunities. And you did mention collaboration, and I think this is the key word in here: collaboration, integration, and innovation. Let me circle back to Dr. Parker and ask a couple of questions, and I'll start with one first, and then we'll move to Dr. Evans. Dr. Parker, you mentioned a couple of things in your presentation. You did mention about the linear value chain and how things used to be done kind of stage sequential. And you mentioned how things evolved when it comes to social media or the example of Amazon. And you mentioned very two good examples for the Coursera learners and how the registration doubled since 2020, and the percentage that you mentioned, 84% of employers intend to digitize work processes. This pretty much tells us we are not on the same era that we used to be like 20 years ago. Now, when it comes to education, how do you see education space as a two-sided market?
Yeah, so I see it as a matching market between content providers and consumers, and so it's almost like a classic medieval market from 1,000 years ago in the way that or 2,000 years ago, in the way that we organize it when it's bricks and mortar. So I work at a small college. We have about 6,500 students, and they by and large come to Hanover, New Hampshire and have a good experience. But it's high cost, it's very personal, but it's still a matching market. I mean, they had to attract faculty as on the supplier side, and then they attract the students on the demand side. I think what's become crystal clear is that a lot of the growth is now in this either hybrid or online space. And what we've seen in industry after industry is that once you start to digitize, then you start to lower the costs of access, you lower the costs of delivery. And higher ed has been incredibly resistant to these changes for a variety of reasons. We're fragmented. We're an old industry. It has a lot of kind of staying power. And honestly, they've even been surprisingly resilient in their ability to absorb new technology, even in the last couple of years. But I think those platform economics and network effect economics are going to start working more and more on higher ed, just like the other industries that have already changed. And the vector, if you will, is going to be these infrastructure investments. So in many ways, these LMS systems and the things that Dr. Abel is talking about are laying the infrastructure necessary to then allow for global access. And so then I can be here. I see now that we have 1.1 thousand participants. I didn't know that Zoom did it that way, so that's pretty cool. The point being, now we have this relatively low friction interaction. So I'll stop there. I want to get to any other questions, but I see it very much as a two-sided or multi-sided market that should only expand over time.
Excellent. Let me take that thought and give it to Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, you mentioned a couple of things, and one of them was the platform roles, and you mentioned one of the key roles that was the platform strategy. So when it comes to that, how do you see education systems transforming into a platform strategy?
Well, let me make one observation. I've been studying the rise of platforms and then the growing demand for platform professionals. One of the things that's very interesting is you cannot find a degree program that is specifically for platform knowledge, right? So you can't go get an MBA and get certified as a platform professional or a platform expert. You can take individual courses, but that doesn't exist. So it's kind of interesting that even in higher education, it's difficult for a student, even despite all of the opportunities to build an incredibly successful career in platforms, becoming a platform professional, getting a certification in that space is quite difficult. You basically have to ad hoc it. You have to go to various programs and assemble your own program. Now, Jeff Parker actually teaches one of the best courses in the world on this, but it doesn't exist as a certification. So, students now have to, they can build their own professional careers and programs, but it's a lot of work for them to do that. So there's a huge opportunity for people that can bring together portfolios of where the best opportunities are. And that can be to serve individuals that want to progress their own careers, but it also can be very valuable for companies that are trying to understand the landscape, because as Dr. Parker mentioned, it is a matching market, but it's very fragmented. And it takes a tremendous amount of work to identify which are the best programs at the right cost, at the right delivery mechanism, whatnot. So I think there's huge opportunity for those guides and curation of the best educational programs out there.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Dr. Abel, the mention of the matchmaking market and the mention of the platform, and the mention in your presentation about having that mess when it comes to education, whether it's higher education or K-12. Now, when it comes to the interoperability in the Edtech ecosystem, what is the role of that? What is the role of interoperability?
Right. Thank you for that question. So, interoperability, if you think of it as a product in itself, is much like other products. Although many who come to the work on standards interoperability think of it as, kind of almost like a mission, in itself, to achieve it. The reality is that if you're working in a university or working in a school district, or if you're a supplier, you want interoperability because it helps you get your products deployed faster and at lower costs, right? And so that's sort of like number one, right? Number one, it has to result in faster, lower cost. And sometimes you get into marketplaces, including ones that are kind of protected, like the education market system, where you will have interoperability standards that actually are harder to use than the API that the product supplier is already giving you. And that's a sure sign that you're kind of on the wrong path. You're on the wrong path. But people want to say, well, let's use the standard because it's a standard. No, the standard actually has to be the best way to do things. And in an IMS, the way we get there is we work with the industry participants, the leaders, and we get them adopting it to make sure that it is. And second of all, I would say, and this is sort of a key piece, sometimes, let's just take the example, let's talk about Coursera is a great sort of courseware platform, that's going to, that has great growth potential, to provide more and more specific courses where we bring that courseware together with specific, consumers, and we'll probably continue to grow there. I always felt that from day one. But really, if you're using that then within the context of an institution, for instance, you want the data from Coursera to be able to be mixable with the data that you're getting from your other platforms, because it may be the same students that are taking those same courses. So really, at a high level, the role of interoperability there, you could say, is we got to make sure these products can work together. What that means, in terms of the actual technical piece of it, it's data interoperability, right? And data in specific areas that are important and useful to education in terms of how education products are used, understanding whether the learner is learning, so embedded assessment, things along those lines. Because ideally, if you're anywhere from an advisor to an individual faculty member, you want to be able to see the information about that student, or even the student themselves, on a single screen, regardless of which platform they happen to be interacting with at any one given time. And I believe that is going to continue to be an important driver into the future of education. As we found with publishers, the major publishers grew to a certain size, and now they're moving to digital, but they're getting lots and lots of competition from other digital sources. But one publisher is not going to meet the need of an education provider, right? There has to be ability to integrate with publisher content from many suppliers into whether it's a corporate training world or K-12 world or a higher ed world. So that ability to integrate across, and I know, for instance, Coursera now is in fact using IMS LTI as an example to what we call deep link into other platforms. So for instance, you could be in your Blackboard platform or Canvas platform or whatever, and you could click a link and it takes a user into Coursera. The user doesn't really even know what's going on behind the scenes, but it's a seamless integration where data is getting passed, and in theory, data can get off, and data also gets passed back on how the student is doing. So that second part is making the products work better together. And I'll say the other one that I'll mention, because it was brought up in the NFT discussion, is the digital credentials that are achieved, the micro credentials in particular. The credentials that are achieved have to be interoperable in order for the student, the learner, to get the most out of that credential. It has to be easily consumed on the other side, and we're doing work in that area as well. Open badges, something called the Comprehensive Learner Record, and so forth. But that's a very important area of interoperability in the Edtech ecosystem that is one of our most exciting areas, quite frankly. And blockchain and the discussion today was fascinating in NFT, because that has not come up before in that context, but blockchain in particular. I just lost my microphone, so sorry. That's it. I'll stop there.
Yeah, we still can hear you, Dr. Abel. Thanks a lot. Let me be very honest. I spent almost all day long today doing two things. One, reading about interoperability, and the second part of my day was practicing how to pronounce interoperability. It was kind of twist longer, but I believe we have about 17 minutes, and we can have a couple of questions. Let me circle back to Dr. Parker and go back to the theme of this session about strategy. Now, why platform strategy is key to bridging the gap between academia and the industry itself?
So I think part of it is being able to articulate literally the roadmap, but more importantly, if you're going to bridge between industry and academia, you've got to get kind of the incentives right. And I think, having been through this for probably 6+7 years now, it's really interesting to see how academic institutions think about intellectual property, how they think about incentives for faculty, how they interact with these kind of global technology providers, the Coursera's, Emeritus, 2U, edX, whoever. And I think they, especially on the academic side, they haven't necessarily done the work, if you will, of aligning their own strategy to that of what's happening in the outer world. And the way you feel that, so I'm both a participant in that market as an outside kind of online educator. I'm an employee of one of these systems, and I also study it as an academic. So I have and I work with a lot of companies, so I kind of bridge a lot of these things. I don't see that many academic institutions that have really aligned strategy for a future in 10, 20, 30 years that seems pretty clear to where they're going. You know, we're super fragmented and siloed, which many organizations face, but academic institutions are even worse. So that work of strategic alignment has to happen in the academic world as much as it has to happen with their potential partners. And those partners can be obviously that complex ecosystem, you know, that Dr. Abel put out, because you've got technology providers, you've got content providers. I think it's really interesting, these matching between large potential consumers, if you'll think like the enterprise consumers, and there's a lot of work to be done. I don't know if I've fully answered the question, other than saying this is really important, and the universities, I think, are in harm's way. They're in harm's way because the world is moving fast around us. So I feel a little bit, we have this kind of origin story in the US of Paul Revere on the horse, you know, one if by land, two if by sea, saying the British are coming. And I feel like the platforms are coming. You know, the world is changing. You people need to pay attention to this, because you're going to wake up one day and go, what happened? And it's sort of like you see change happen slowly at first, and then you wake up and the whole world's different. It's sort of slowly and then all at once. That's where I think the need for aligning strategy is incredibly important.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Parker. You did actually answer the question, and I think part of this is a catch-up game when it comes to academia, because there is something that is always kind of holding them back, whether it's funding or policy makers or decision makers, etc. But I think nowadays things need to be changed from academia perspective and kind of mental sets to almost the business side of it to be approached that way. Let me go back to you, Dr. Evans, and ask you this question. Do you see this transition through e-learning would succeed as other platform domains?
So I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Do you see this transition through e-learning would succeed as other platform domains?
So, I mean, I think it's already happening, right? And so what is success in this space? The space that I've been looking at in particular is professional education, post formal kind of education. Companies now, what's really interesting, as the job market has been changing, they're finding that it's not enough just to offer higher wages to employees. They're actually looking for other benefits, and one of those benefits can be education. And so companies now are competing on the offerings that they can provide, both to raise up, and identify their fast trackers and professional development, and what's the next generation of leaders for those companies. But they also need to provide it as a benefit. There's a company in the United States that's rebranding right now that is targeting that market specifically, and it's going after the very big employers like Walmart. And Walmart is finding that it's not enough, and in fact, it can be not enough to attract the right employees just to offer them a 30-cent or $1 raise in their salary. What people want is actually a broader set of benefits. Obviously, healthcare is one that gets a lot of attention, but I think we're going to see education become more in the mix in the future. And that raises some really interesting questions. Walmart is not an educational institution, but it can benefit dramatically from engaging that fragmented market. The question is who is in the best position to aggregate those content providers and deliver a company the size of Walmart what it needs to provide its employees with educational benefits. And so that, to me, is a super interesting question, which is, can you provide enough educational benefits to retain people so you don't have that churn? Churn is very expensive for companies, but at a lower cost than potentially raising salaries. So I think education becomes a super interesting way of engaging employees with value at a cost that is actually quite attractive from a company from an aggregated perspective. The question is, how do you deliver that at scale? And I think platform strategies do that. So I think that's where these platform companies are looking. In fact, if you look at that Coursera study or investor report, the fastest growing segment in Coursera's portfolio is corporate, right? And so that's an extremely interesting market, and corporate people have a longer engagement with people than universities do, right? They have maybe 2 years or 4 years, whereas an employer may have, 15 or 20 years. The question is what kind of educational opportunities do you provide over the course of those people's professional careers? That's why I'm very excited about the deployment of NFTs, because it can track and create cohorts for particular learning in a very dynamic fashion. So we could see this kind of technology embraced in the credentialing. And so when we come back and look at Rob's chart of where investment is flowing into the edtech space, I bet we're going to see a lot of money flow into this as technology becomes an enabler for the goals that organizations want to achieve.
Well said, Dr. Evans. Thanks a lot. I'll have the last question for you, Dr. Abel. How do you see adoption interoperability standards would bring in compliance efficiency in the edtech ecosystem?
Yes, okay, thank you. In some ways, Dr. Parker said it very well in terms of what some of our experience has been. And and what he said was things are changing, and all of a sudden you wake up and it's different, right? The kind of things are changing, the infrastructure is getting laid, and then all of a sudden, boom, you kind of wake up. That's kind of what happened. I came into IMS in 2006, and it was a great organization in terms of some of its technical capability, but my main job was to get it more market focused, right? Get it kind of focused on actually the test there is that new entrants can come in, but also the established entrants are actually implementing the standards, right? And so we managed to get the major suppliers and so forth and institutions around the table, but it took 2, 3, 4, 5 years of them sort of starting to implement the standards. And then all of a sudden we would go to a conference, like a major conference in the US for higher ed, say EDUCAUSE, and we'd be talking to a supplier on the side, a major supplier, like say a McGraw-Hill, as a publisher or something, and they'll be going, hey, Rob, you might want to know that we were doing all these custom integrations, and then we had to integrate with so-and-so, and we said, and they were doing LTI, and we were doing LTI, and then we said, well, why don't we just try to do it with LTI? And we did it, and it just worked, bingo. And actually then we ran the numbers, and LTI is just one example, but it's really it was 1,000x cost savings, 1,000 times, because literally prior to LTI, it took 6 months of calendar time and about $50,000 of effort to do a custom integration into a platform. And literally, if you run the numbers, now it takes at most a few hours, right? Ideally, it takes just a few minutes. It's been a huge savings of time. Now, once it happens, nobody's excited about it anymore, right? It's like, okay, now everybody just sort of expects it. But that's what we like to say. It kind of changes the world forever, and now it's time to move to the next thing. But we're doing that in many, many different areas, but those are actually case studies. And so when you see that chart of the IMS membership growing, that's why. I mean, the members are voting with their dollars, they're getting return on their investment, and they see IMS as an important force. Now, once you achieve in doing that with the major suppliers, then it does open the door for much smaller suppliers. And that was the next sort of surprising thing that happened, which was okay. Now we were hearing about a very small company that built a special app just for music education that actually helped students compose music and grade their ability to compose music on time. And now they were basically saying that, well, they could sell their app to an entire state system because it was integratable. They didn't have to spend the money to do the integration, right? And then when they had other situations where that system or a university would change their LMS, and guess what? The integration still worked. The integration still worked. They didn't have to redo the integration. So that's why I like to say in the smaller organizations are where a lot of the innovation is. It is very much kind of a long tail phenomena. And then finally, so it saves money for them, tremendous efficiencies. But then very obviously, I guess, for the institutions themselves, for the education providers, it just gives them greater choice, right? They have greater choice, and it does save them money on integration because they also are doing integrations. They have technical staff, and particularly I'll say in K-12, where the technical staff are not as many people, they don't have as much money to do integrations, and actually their scale of digital products of usage is actually higher. It really helps them the most, but ultimately it helps the learner because the learner now has choice, either because the teacher's helping them choose. That's one of the fundamental things we know about learning is the more different ways something can be presented to someone, the higher probability that they are going to be able to understand it and learn it. And so now there's greater choice in because of the fact that it's easier to plug those resources together. And as we've alluded to here, now that's infrastructure that everyone can take advantage of. It really does help lift up the entire industry with the mindset of, we can get anywhere we want. We can get our products anywhere we need to get them. And it's been a long road. 16 years is not a short amount of time for me, but so part of that is the kind of the education. That's why I love this discussion about platform, and I really want to thank you for pulling that together, because this is really a topic that educations and educators that need to be talking about and understanding.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Abel, and thanks for being catalyst for so many years in this field. We truly appreciate everything you've been doing, and hopefully we will carry on and make this momentum going. We have more questions, but I'm afraid we cannot answer them in this session as we are at the end of our session. And on behalf of the National E-Learning Center and the International Conference on E-Learning for Human Capability Development, we thank our distinguished speakers for this insightful session and our audience for being very interactive during the session. Please note, the next session will start at 8 p.m. KSA time, which is about 30 minutes from now, and the session will be focused on e-learning platform experience. Once again, Dr. Jeffrey Parker, Dr. Peter Evans, and Dr. Rob Abel from Riyadh City, from the heart of NEL's building, thank you so much and have an amazing night.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.